The film begins with an interview with Richard Kuklinski, who is asked if he is sorry for the crimes he committed. The scene then shifts to him as he begins work in Jersey City, New Jersey, on April 29, 1964. One evening, he met the woman of his life, Deborah, for the first time. He invites her for coffee at a nearby cafe, and they talk about their lives and jobs. He reveals to her that he works as a dubber for Disney. At first, Richard hesitates to talk about his life, and Deborah is wary of him because he is not a big talker. However, there is something inside Richard that attracts Deborah, and the two spend a nice evening together. Later, Deborah's aunt picks her up after their date and drives her home. Later, Richard goes to a bar where he plays billiards with his friends. They discuss Deborah, and Earl, one of his playmates, claims to know her since he has been dating his other friend. Earl insults Deborah by saying that she is a hooker, and Richard becomes enraged, but he keeps calm. Eventually, Earl loses the game and, for a moment, refuses to pay Richard. The two almost fight, but then Earl leaves the money there. Later, Earl leaves and goes directly to his car. He does not notice Richard when he opens the door and cuts his throat with a knife. The protagonist wipes the fingerprints off the door and leaves. A year later, on September 14, 1965, Richard is waiting in a hospital in Elmer, New Jersey, as Deborah has given birth to their first daughter. In the next scene, the protagonist is in his laboratory, where he creates pornographic films. Then, Roy Lepron, his friend, contacts him and informs him that their client has requested the films, but since Richard is tired and is missing 7 boxes, he will go home to rest first. When he leaves, a car arrives with 3 men inside, looking for a man named Dino. Roy is the boss, and his 2 assistants are Josh Rosenthal and Mickey Spicoli. Roy approaches Richard and asks him where Dino is. Although Richard has no idea where he is, the protagonist says he is not in the lab, but Roy wants to check anyway. When they enter, they find no one and begin threatening Richard. Before leaving, Josh invites Richard to the Gemini Lounge the following morning. Richard returns home first to take care of his daughter and learns through the newspaper Deborah is reading that she is looking for a bigger house. The two sleep, and the next day Richard goes to the Gemini Lounge, where the 3 men from yesterday meet with him. Roy tries to scare Richard by pointing a gun in his face, but he remains unmoved, surprising everyone. Then Roy states that he wants to put an end to Richard's adult film business. Roy points out that he now has no job, but he can still work for him. At this point, Roy decides to test Richard by asking him to go out and kill a beggar. Richard takes the gun and approaches the beggar. When the man is distracted, Richard shoots him in the stomach and then runs away. Next, Roy hires Richard as his hitman, instructing him to collect money and debts from people and kill them if necessary. In the next scene, Richard performs his first assignment, and after taking a stranger's money, he kills him. Richard begins to earn a lot of money and is able to better provide for his family. Richard completes mission after mission in cold blood. On May 5, 1975, Richard invites his friends to a spectacular dinner party in Dumont, New Jersey. Terry and Dino are the same friends he hung out with a few years earlier. They, too, bring their wives and share stories about their lives. One of the women wrongly claims that Richard is creating adult films. Deborah, on the other hand, explains his job, which is to exchange money by exploiting inflation. That is why he has become rich so quickly. After dinner, the scene shifts to February 13, 1976. Josh exchanges drugs with 2 Cubans on Manhattan's Lower East Side. He eventually kills them, steals the money, and flees once the transaction is completed. Meanwhile, Richard and Deborah are making love in their bedroom when their daughter Betsy knocks on the door because she has had a bad dream. Soon after, Richard sends her to her room to sleep and resumes what he was doing with his wife. The next day, a messenger named Leo appears in the salon and talks to Roy, explaining that the Gambinos are aware of what Josh did to their men. Now they are enraged and plan to track them down. Leo suggests killing Josh, but Roy objects because he considers Josh to be his son. The two have a strong disagreement, and Roy is stressed. However, Leo advises him to settle the matter if he wants to avoid a war. In the next scene, Richard sends his daughters off to school and goes to work. Richard goes to a hotel where Marty and Alex, a prostitute, are having fun. Marty is filming Alex, and they are about to kiss when Richard knocks on the door and goes inside. We then see Marty on the phone with Roy to talk about Josh and whatever they need to accomplish. When the conversation ends, Richard is about to kill Marty, but he asks him to pray first, which doesn't work, so he kills him. When Richard is about to leave, he notices someone inside the closet and finds Alex. Richard takes her out and spares her life. However, a man named Robert Prong, commonly known as Freezy, appears and gives them permission to leave the building, because he will blow it up. Freezy tells Richard to get into the ice cream truck, which irritates him because Alex saw his face and escaped. Afterwards, Freezy tries to chase her, but Richard tells him to let her go because he has a reputation and doesn't want to hurt women or children. Richard shoots the glass, and Freezy abruptly stops the truck. Then Richard gets out, and Freezy leaves. The next evening, Roy summons Richard to his office. As they have dinner together, Roy expresses his disappointment with Richard for leaving a witness alive. Roy also states that they will take a break because they are being chased by an enemy gang because of Josh, so Richard gets fired. The protagonist leaves disappointed because he is now out of a job. The next day, the police call him at home, but he continually hangs up. Richard visits Treston State Prison, where his older brother, Joey, is being held for raping and killing a 12-year-old boy. It turns out that it was Joey himself who called him home. The two conversed for a while because Richard has not visited him in prison since he has been locked up. Joey asks for Richard's assistance in finding a lawyer, but the two do not get along. Joey is aware of Richard's crimes and assures him that he, too, will be a prisoner. Richard starts to leave the prison and continues to do so while Joey rants, screams, and curses at him. In the next scene, Richard and his family head to the skating rink, where he watches his children play while Deborah talks to a friend. As they drive home, Richard is distracted and accidentally hits the car in front of him. The man in the car aggressively approaches him from the outside, but when Richard gets out of the car, the man is startled and returns to his vehicle. When things seem to calm down, the man curses Richard's family. Outraged, Richard chases the car from street to street, despite his wife, Deborah, and children yelling at him to stop. The chase sequence is interrupted when a cab bars his way. Deborah becomes furious with Richard, who apologizes. Richard returns home and takes a shower after what has happened. He recalls his childhood when he witnessed his father's violent abuse of his brother in their room. From there, the coldness and absence of emotions emerged. Later, Deborah asks Richard what is wrong when he watches TV in their living room. Deborah complains about how he acts as if he doesn't care anymore. When he hears this, Richard starts being outrageous again. He loses control and his temper. He throws everything aside and destroys everything he sees. Deborah apologizes, and Richard clarifies that all he cares about is the family. The next morning, Richard meets Freezy and asks him for help because he is currently unemployed. The two agree to become criminal partners. With a 50-50 split, Richard will do the dirty work while Freezy will focus on the details. One evening, Freezy shows Alex's body inside the freezer of the ice cream truck, where he freezes it until the appropriate time to dump it somewhere. The two begin cutting up people's body parts and freezing them after Richard kills them. Thanks to the new job, Richard can take his family to fancy restaurants for dinner and entertainment. One day, Roy summons his men to the Gemini Lounge, and Leo is among them. The two start a fight because Josh has killed the Gambino boys. Roy shoots Josh, killing him, because this is his only option to stop the war against the Gambinos. Later, Leo goes into a New York movie theater and talks to Freezy about killing someone. He promises him $40,000 if he can kill the victim and another $10,000 if it looks like a natural death. Back at the office, Freezy and Richard plan the murder. Richard will use Freezy's approach of using cyanide. This will be his first time. Freezy shows him how to kill the person by blowing him up with powder. It is essential that the death be more natural so that he can get the $10,000 bonus. Later that evening, Richard and Freezy go to a bar. They dance and act normal. Then, while Freezy stands by, Richard carefully blows powder on a man's face, making him cough and preventing him from breathing. Suddenly, an old friend named Terry calls Richard's name as he prepares to leave. Terry says he is now married and needs a job. Richard promises he will think about it and then walks away. In the next scene, Richard is shaving his beard as he writes a poem for Annabelle's 16th birthday. Richard greets the guests and recites the poem. Suddenly, someone knocks on their door. It is Roy's henchman. The man tells Richard that the boss wants to talk to him. Initially, Richard refuses but then gets into Roy's car. Meanwhile, Deborah peers out the window. When Richard enters, Roy immediately draws his gun and points it furiously at him. Roy has discovered that Richard is working with Freezy under the supervision of Leo Marks. Richard initially denies it, but then realizes that Terry talked to Roy and told him everything. When his daughter Annabelle approaches the car, Richard begs Roy not to hurt her. When Annabelle knocks on the car window and asks Richard if he is alright, Roy orders his henchman not to touch her. Finally, Roy lets him go and threatens to kill him and his family if he finds out he is still working for Leo Marks. Richard returns to the house full of anger, hatred, and frustration. Later, Richard is on the phone with Terry and asks him what he told Roy, but Terry denies having spoken. This infuriates Richard, but he remains cool. The protagonist tells him that he has a little job for him. Richard assigns him a minor task and tells him to meet him at a hotel tomorrow. In the next scene, we find out that Richard has called Terry to the hotel to kill him because he betrayed him. On Christmas Day, Freezy keeps contacting Richard, which irritates him because it is ruining his vacation. Freezy tells him about a new job but reveals that Leo has not yet paid him $50,000 for the previous job. As a result, Richard meets Leo at a cemetery and demands the promised $50,000. Leo refuses because of unforeseen circumstances, as Roy has discovered that he was the one who commissioned Freezy and Richard to do the job. Richard tries to intimidate him, but Leo tells him that if he dies, his men will kill him. When Richard pretends to calm down and is about to leave, he pulls out his gun and kills Leo. Richard quickly realizes what he has done and panics slightly. He then steals Leo's jewelry and leaves. Later, his daughter, Betsy, calls him, saying that Annabelle is in the hospital because of a car accident. Richard rushes to the hospital, where he discovers that his daughter is in serious condition. Deborah is also angry with him, and he justifies himself by saying it is because of his work. Then the protagonist leaves, promising to find the one who hurt his daughter. The next day, Richard meets Freezy in a park. Freezy states that Roy is on their heels and will torture their loved ones, so he proposes to kill each other's families. Richard becomes enraged and strangles Freezy, but then lets him go. When he realizes that Freezy knows where he lives, Richard shoots him repeatedly and then leaves. Richard returns to the hospital, accompanied by his best friend, Dino. He tells the protagonist what happened to Terry, who was shot and thrown away. He also describes to him the town's notorious killer, called Iceman. Dino advises him to take the family and get out of town, but Richard says he must put an end to something first. One day, Richard walks into a restaurant and meets Dominic, another killer with whom he wants to work together. They both agree to kill their victims with cyanide and split the money. Richard returns home to care for his sick wife, Deborah. Later, the protagonist meets Dominic to get the cyanide. Then, as he plans to make cyanide sandwiches to give to the victims, he tries to feed some to a stray cat. Soon after, when Deborah gets into the car, he notices that the kitten is not dead, a sign that something is wrong. When Richard starts the car, police cars rush to the scene and block the road. The officers arrest him and detain Deborah. Later, it turns out that Dominic is an undercover agent hired to track him down. The film ends with an interview with an elderly Richard, who is asked if he is sorry for something he has done, but he says no. He is sorry for hurting the people most important to him, his family. Richard was sentenced to 2 life terms and never saw his family again. That's all from the video. Thanks for your time. And take care.